Welcome back. I hope you had a good and fruitful time. And I hope you got just a little chance to see how God's goodness is waiting to reach out to you. Having said that, I think we all experience that we don't always succeed in the spiritual lives that we want to have, that there are different blocks towards receiving God's love, different blocks to us giving loving attention to God in return and being able to speak out of that. So I want to name a few of the blocks and the challenges that we have so that you will not be thinking, why am I experiencing this? That you will know you are not the only one. The first challenge that we have in this kind of spiritual life for preaching is just flat out distraction, kind of gazing and beholding and having a schedule. Those things don't go well together. Wanting to drop outside of time and being bound by time. It's very difficult. And I think a lot of people have found it especially difficult in this pandemic time when the boundaries of public space and private space have been blurred. And we were talking before we got on, we started recording. Some people have a ton of private space, and some people have no private space or time anymore. So it's a real challenge. It means it's all the more imperative to create those moments of just kind of creative boredom, where there is a little white space and a little margin. I've been really aware lately how much my phone is an enemy to that, because a lot of the times in life that I would have taken a pause and taken a breath, waiting at a traffic light, standing in line somewhere, instead of having that white space, I have my phone. So you don't have to necessarily set aside your 10 minutes with the timer, although you can, but just to be attentive to letting a little bit of breath into your life. Um, and that also relates to creating moments of flow. People will talk about those moments where you lose yourself in what you're doing. Um, for a lot of people, it's creating visual art. For a lot of people, it's physical exercise. I experienced that when running. But your brain, there's a neurological change that happens and it flips into this right-brained mode. So we can be intentional about the way we structure our time to just put up a little bit of a wall against distraction. I think you all have probably talked about a rule of life, or most people at this point know what that is. That is probably the most important spiritual practice you will develop during seminary. Um, and by this, it's not some grand goal setting. My rule of life is that I awaken every morning at 4 a.m. and I pray this, and I go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Really, a rule of life is just a way of structuring your time and setting boundaries. The rule of life basically says, these are the things that are non-negotiable for me. And holding to those. In scriptural terms, it's Jesus when he talks to Mary about the one thing or the better part. Of course, the challenge is always we don't have to choose between the good and the bad. We have to choose between the good and the good. So it's learning what gives you your foundation, your true north. And just as a note, I mean, we're talking about this as it relates to preaching, but if you can help the people you love and serve do that too, you're doing them a great service. So one of the blocks is distraction and time. Another block is that we get discouraged. There are times when we sit down to preach, to notice, to attend, to tell people, and we have nothing to say. It doesn't seem to be working. Or if it does, it's like this great flash and we don't know how it happened. We have no control over it. And so if you're experiencing that block, there's the piece of remembering your calling, your why you are in this. Um, because this is an invitation to exercise the calling to be yourself. Um, most of us, we're really not called to achieve something, but we're called to do something. We're not called to produce sermons. We're called to preach. We're called not to the result, but to the activity. And so keeping that call, that story very central, that can sustain you during those dry times. Sometimes I think of it that, I'm really encouraged by God to make a mess, not to produce something. And so for those times when I am a mess, it's a reminder that's kind of what I'm called to be in process. So another block is fear. And this is where it starts to get really difficult. And one of the reasons I have always loved the Gospel of Mark is because of its ending, and not the tacked on ending, but the original ending. Jesus rose and they all ran away in fear, because sometimes it's the only honest response we have. So then I start to think about, well, what are these fears? And I think there's some, I think the reading for next week, there's something from a book called Art and Fear, which enumerates a whole lot of the fears we have whenever we are trying to create something. Fears about yourself. Probably every one of you has heard these voices in your head at some point. I don't really deserve to be up here. You have to be born a preacher. I don't have talent. The fear about perfection. It's not worth doing unless I can do it absolutely right. Or this fear about magic, like that inspiration floats down only from outside. There are fears about the reception of what you offer as a preacher. Will I be understood? If I am understood, will I be liked? Because we all want to be liked all the time, it seems. There's a fear about being about being vulnerable, whether it's before other people or being vulnerable before God. And the thing about fear is that fear can calcify into shame. And shame, everybody's probably had it at some time or another. Shame is the desire not to be seen. I mean, think about Adam and Eve in the garden. They were ashamed. They went and hid themselves. And for a preacher, this is toxic, because what we're really doing is being seen. We're being that person, the public person who is called to share her spiritual life publicly. Art and Fear, which is one of my favorite books, has this great piece about stopping versus quitting. And we can stop plenty of times. We put the work down. It's too hard. It's too scary. We are just done with preaching and, just decide we're going to phone it in instead. But every time we pick it back up again, we're choosing not to quit. And so we have to come back into that fear over and over again. This is hard. And what makes it possible, I think the only thing that makes it possible, is being in relationship with God. Because if we're in relationship with God, that starts with love. And that means that if you know love, you know acceptance. And that means you know grace. So if you're struggling to preach, and that will be all of us sooner or later, if you're struggling to preach, you may need to go back to that spiritual foundation of figuring out, how is it that I do know that I'm loved by God? What gives me that certainty? And really, that's the work of a lifetime. And that's why preaching is a practice. And I say that in both meanings of the words. It's a practice. It's something we do all the time. And it's also something we do imperfectly all the time. Thank goodness. And paradoxically, it's not all about you. And I know that sounds strange after we've spent so much time in this course talking about how personal things are. But we feel sometimes like, oh my gosh, we have to have it ourselves. Like you can't give it if you don't have it. But again, the ordination vows, we promise to nourish people from the riches of God's grace, not our own. And thank God for that, because God's grace lasts when ours run out. Preaching is the kind of thing that we can persist in practicing regardless of how we feel, because it's not about what we might have in us at any given moment, but it's about what God has to offer to people. And in the end, this is a really joyful thing. Making art of any kind connects you to the first artist, to God. That's who God is. And speaking connects us to the speaker of the word. This is God's gift of love to us. So the thing that I hope you would take away is knowing that preaching can make you feel loved. And it's not going to be this way every week, but ultimately it can become not a chore, but a response to love. And then there's delight and play and joy. And you don't have to preach on any given Sunday. You get to preach. I think Ruthanna now wants to say a little bit more about different ways to encourage all of that spiritual growth.
Yes, well, what I particularly want to talk about is the assignments for sermon number 2, because the way we set this syllabus up, we have a first set of journal pages for the first sermon that's a little bit more kind of analytical and marches you through certain kinds of questions we want you to ask. We still want you to do that process for the second sermon, although not to turn in the journal. But for the second sermon, we want to encourage a more sort of creative, right brain, if you like, approach to preparing sermons, which connects up with this theme of spirituality, because what these practices are all about is kind of connecting you with your relationship with God and going down into those depths where God is encountered. So there's 4 of them, and I'm looking over at the syllabus to talk to them about them for a minute. The first one is embodiment of text. So Anne talked a minute ago about getting yourself into a relationship of discernment and responsiveness to the text. And one of the prime ways we're inviting you to do this is by actually learning it by heart. So actually, instead of using the word memorize, think of it as learning by heart, which is to take it into your body and your mind and your spirit and your heart, so that it becomes part of you and you become part of it. So it's this wonderful relationship of intimacy, really, between you and the text. This practice of learning scripture by heart and speaking it aloud was much more common in past days. And I think some of us might feel quite nervous about having to remember a chunk of scripture. If that's the case for you, just pick a small part of your text. But we want you to learn by heart some part of the text that you're going to preach your second sermon on, and then bring it in and present it in your section. And your instructors will tell you how to do that. I mean, in what, when, and how to do that. So that's the first thing. The second one is dislocated exegesis, which is also about discernment. It's really about getting yourself out of your normal context, going somewhere. And this, of course, will be harder in the pandemic, but choose an outdoor location, say, and just being in that spot for a while, reading the text in that place, and then seeing how it speaks to you. So getting out into a public park, or walking down a street that you don't normally walk down, or if you feel comfortable going into a grocery store, a laundromat, something like that, and looking at how the text speaks to you in that context. The third thing is a piece of artwork on the scripture text. So there again, what you're doing is cultivating that intimacy through this creative process, whether it's drawing a picture, painting a painting, writing a poem, doing a midrash, doing a dance, writing a piece of music, whatever it is, something that unlocks that kind of creative side. And then the final one is writing a prophetic oracle. We have on the website a handout that shows the sort of structure of the prophetic oracle. We want you to write only one of these. There's a structure for an oracle of judgment. These are all like taking from the Old Testament prophets. Oracle of judgment. There's also an oracle of lament. And then there's an oracle of hope. Don't write all 3, just do one, but follow the form as closely as you can, because poetry really relies on form to unlock content. So the limits of that form will allow you to go deeper, and experience a little bit of what it was like for the prophets to have to march through these different steps in proclaiming a word from God. So we want you to turn these 4 items in as part of your work on sermon number 2. And those are all spiritual practices one way or another. And all of them are about cultivating this deeper connection with the text and the world, allowing your discernment to be sharpened and deepened.
One second. I want to commend someone to you all. This is Howard Thurman, the great mystic, theologian, contemplative thinker. He was, in many respects, one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century, influencing many of those who came to prominence during the civil rights movement. But Howard Thurman's big practice in spirituality was one of silence. And in his preaching style and in his life, he was known for the ways in which he interspersed silence in his life. So even in his sermons, he would give great pauses, but even in his life, he was committed to silence as a way of getting a chance to understand God. And the many people who benefited from his approach attest to the power of what silence and reaching for mystical and spiritually profound practices and perspectives, what that does for one's social activity. And so before, I would be remiss if I didn't shout out Howard Thurman. Check him out. Definitely worth your reading and your listening.
Mark, was that an LP you held up?
Record, baby, a record. So yeah, I have a record player. So yeah.
Awesome.
New school and old school.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. We wish you a blessed week, and we will see you on Thursday.